New York City rent control landlords are getting absolutely crushed by inflation, and the paltry 3.25% increase approved by the Rent Guidelines Board won't even cover half of the increased expenses. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you coming out of New York City, and it has to do with the city's rent control policy. And when I read this article, I realized that, hey, this is the perfect example I need to say why rent control doesn't work, why allowing government to set the prices on, a product doesn't work. Okay, government price controls on a product create more problems than they were initially supposed to resolve. So rent control is a prime example of that, and we're seeing that in live action right now in New York City. While inflation is through the roof at over 8%, well, they didn't exactly even allow landlords to raise their rents. I think it was like 3.25%, okay, for 1-year leases. That's insanely low. It wasn't enough to cover the increased costs that they are facing. And, there's only going to be one result. We're going to end up with either landlords who are going into extreme financial distress or properties that are extremely, not maintained, dilapidated, safety hazards, etc. Or we might see both, okay? Honest truth. What do they expect? They expect the landlord to just sit there and take these losses and not be able to do anything about it? Well, yeah, they do. Okay, and this is the problem. They have these ideals in their head that, oh yeah, everything will work perfect if the government sets the price. The government doesn't know how much things cost. And they actually break down in very good detail in this article the costs involved and why this rent increase that was proposed isn't nearly enough. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think, okay? Do you believe that the government, people, bureaucrats or politicians, people who are not even involved in the business, even people involved in the business have difficulty setting prices. But do you believe these government people can set the prices of rents and have any clue about what the actual expenses are? And keep in mind, the expenses are different from every individual company or landlord, okay? It's not going to be the same no matter what. My financing is not the same as the other landlord down the street who got financing with a different bank at a different interest rate at a different time, okay? The repairman I got to fix my plumbing problem is different than the repairman that other landlord over there got. They make a lot of generalizations, but this is why each individual landlord should be allowed to determine how much their rent increase is going to be on their own and not have to depend upon the government to make that decision for them. Okay, imagine if all businesses had to run like that, okay? Imagine if the car manufacturer was like, the government came up and said, well, we believe that, your labor costs are going to be this, and then not realizing that, hey, their labor costs are way higher than that. Or, hey, we believe that, fuel is going to be this much, not realizing that, hey, fuel prices go up and down and they just went way up. But anyway, let's get into this article. So this article is coming from therealdeal.com, and it says, inflation crushing rent stabilized owners, landlord group. Let's get into it. October could have offered some reprieve for cash-strapped owners of rent-stabilized buildings. Instead, a report from a prominent landlord group finds they will continue to lose ground despite the annual rent increase they can charge in leases signed after October 1st. The report was produced by the Community Housing Improvement Program, which advocated for a larger rent hike, but using data compiled by the Rent Guidelines Board staff, which is independent of the industry. In June, the board approved the first full-year rent hikes on stabilized apartments since the pandemic began, 3.25% on 1-year leases and 5% on 2-year leases. Yeah, I covered that story before. So this rent hike is minuscule, and because they didn't allow any rent hikes during the entire pandemic, this doesn't even put them up to where they should have been a couple of years ago. Okay, they are way behind on the rents they should be allowed to charge, and unfortunately, this is going to have some major consequences, especially for the tenants, because the tenants are the ones who have to live in these buildings. The landlords, they could face financial collapse too, and I always talk about the landlords, but do I want to see tenants living in buildings that aren't up to date, that aren't safe? No, I don't. But that is the end result when you do not give the landlords enough money to actually keep the buildings in good shape. But let's continue. Before the vote, owners decried the proposed increases, arguing that even the 4.5% raise the board staff had recommended to keep pace with expenses wouldn't cut it, especially with inflation getting worse. Now, the CHIP analysis finds that for many rent-stabilized owners, 3.25% pencils out to a pittance. The city's pre-1974 properties with at least 80% of units rent regulated will see operating costs increase by more than double that amount, according to the Landlord Group's report. Those buildings make up nearly 80% of all housing outside of core Manhattan. So almost 80% of all the housing outside of the Manhattan core, and all the other boroughs, right, is this pre-1974 stuff. It's older housing, okay? And that means that it's under these rent regulations. Now, they call it rent stabilization. I don't like that because it's like they're trying to hide what it really is. It's rent control. I know people have commented before in my comments, hey, it's not rent control, it's rent stabilization. Same thing, okay? Just because it has a fancy new name doesn't mean that's not what it is. And you're not fooling anybody with this name change. Okay, so let's continue. Inflation is the primary culprit. When the rent board recommended the 4.5% rent bump, it accounted for a consumer price index that had risen 4% between March 2021 and February 2022. But inflation has since nearly doubled to 7.7%, the report reads. CHIP calculates that an 8% rent bump would have been needed for owners of heavily rent-stabilized properties to keep pace with operating costs, which it estimates have risen by $939 per apartment. Wow, that's a lot of money per apartment annually. They include insurance, utilities, administrative costs, and maintenance. Multifamily buildings are attractive to many investors because their rents can be raised to account for inflation. But for rent-stabilized units, increases are limited by the Rent Guidelines Board. And the board was trying to use the most optimistic numbers they possibly could because they are afraid. They're afraid that, hey, we won't look like, we're actually in support of the tenants and, we won't look like we're progressives. And so they took what the actual information and, they swayed it so that it would not give the appropriate amount of rent increase, right? So they just did whatever they could to basically screw landlords over and not allow the appropriate increase needed. And yeah, they saw themselves helping the tenants, but they really are hurting the tenants because the tenants are the ones who are ultimately going to suffer in these crappy, dilapidated buildings. I've told you in many other videos, that is the result of this rent control policy. Okay, when you have landlords who no longer can afford to do the capital expenditures on time, who can no longer afford to make upgrades to the buildings, you end up with a very dated, obsolete, horrible housing stock. Okay, and that's not what is the best thing for the tenants overall. And that's my opinion, but hey, they need to really look at the economics of the situation to realize, hey, economists have been saying forever that rent control doesn't work and that this is what it would cause, but they just ignore it. They ignore it because they think they know better than everyone else. As evidence, the group points to a rent board memo from April that shows that the average rent per month in older buildings outside of core Manhattan that are 100% rent stabilized is only $5 to $15 less than those that are 80% rent stabilized. Factoring in higher financing costs since the Fed hiked interest rates this year, which are also excluded from the board's older data, CHIP pegs net operating income for heavily stabilized buildings at around $443 per unit. But that doesn't include energy costs, which the Rent Guideline Board also lowballed, the report claims. In last year's report on operating costs, the board projected that the fuel prices would only grow by 0.1%. They rose by 19.6%. So yeah, the Rent Guidelines Board, they lowballed the increase in the cost of fuel, even though everyone saw fuel costs rising when they, did their calculations. They just, it was only a 0.1% increase. And meanwhile, it's in reality nearly a 20% increase for fuel costs. I've read that, the heating oil is very expensive. Okay. And for these older buildings, that is a big, huge cost. Okay. Now, this article actually goes into some of the more detailed elements of these costs, right? And that's why I like this, because you can tell it was written by people within the real estate industry or by landlords, and they got into the nitty gritty here, right? And I'm going to skip down a little bit because I like getting into these numbers, because this is reality. For the tenants watching this right now who didn't know, right, this is the reality of the rent control situation. CHIP estimates the massive underestimation of gas expenses, which account for about 7% of stabilized owners' overall costs, will be $150 annually per unit. In all, those expenses will leave owners with a yearly income of $293 per unit, which the report claims is not enough to fund major repairs. For example, a boiler replacement runs about $172,600, according to Homes and Community Renewal, the state agency that oversees rent stabilization. Using a 50-unit building as an average property, CHIP's report estimates owners would net about $20,000 per year if no major work were done. This means it would take 9 years for the building to build up enough reserves to afford a boiler replacement, the report reads. And that's just one of the capital expenditures owners face. CHIP estimates a properly run 50-unit building spends about $100,000 on capital costs each year. Yeah, and the capital costs are going to be more expensive in these pre-1974 buildings. They're old. That is just a fact, okay? So when we're talking about, hey, replacing this boiler, and yeah, you're not going to have to replace a boiler every single year, right? But replacing the boiler on a 50-unit building is almost $175,000. But with the inflation costs increasing and the fact that the landlords can't raise their rent, they are only netting $20,000 a year on a 50-unit building. You know how ridiculous that is? I mean, it's kind of hard to fathom it, right? Unless you are within the real estate industry, right? So I like to use the example that, hey, I had a fourplex, right? And, it was fully financed, and I was netting $5,000 a year on a fourplex, okay? So I could have 4 fourplexes, each one netting me $5,000 per year, and I'm making $20,000. Or I could own this 50-unit building in New York and barely net, like 30 additional units, and I'm making less profit. That doesn't even make sense, okay? I realize that landlords in New York are investing for the appreciation, right? But how are you supposed to get appreciation out of this building if you can't increase the rents, right? That's how commercial buildings are evaluated. Their valuations are based upon their rental income. Now, they have extremely low cap rates there, which makes it a little bit easier to get those super high values, but I just, I don't see this as a sustainable practice, okay? And other than extremely rich people who are just looking for a minuscule rate of return on their investment, I don't see purchasing a rent stabilized building as a landlord as being a good, in New York City or anywhere for that matter, being a good idea at all.